Hi, everyone. Welcome to Echoes of Time in Type. I'm Debbie Millman, and I am here to facilitate a conversation with Paula Scher and Rob Saunders. We are going to be talking about part of what we're going to be talking about is an exhibit that's right here on campus at the Resnick Center for Herbert Bayer Studies. It is an exhibit called Bauhaus Typography at 100. And the exhibit explores the really unique impact that the Bauhaus has had in graphic design, in typography, through course materials, product catalogs, stationery, promotional flyers, and ephemera. And if you haven't already seen it, right after we're done, you must run over to the Resnick Center to be able to see it. It is extraordinary. I had a view of it this morning, and it's worth the price of admission. The exhibition draws a through line from the Bauhaus School's iconic style to the shape of typography today. And I'm going to talk with both the curator of the exhibition and one of the most acclaimed graphic designers in the world here today, Paula Scher and Rob Saunders. Paula, as you all probably know, is a partner in the New York office of the distinguished international design consultancy Pentagram. She's been there since 1991. Just a few of her clients include the Public Theater, the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Opera, Tiffany and Company, Citibank, and Microsoft, all of which have become landmarks of modern branding. She's also been the recipient of hundreds of industry honors. Rob Saunders is the executive director and the curator of Letterform Archive, which aside from all of the great work he's doing, he's saving so much important graphic design for preservation. He's the curator of Bauhaus Typography at 100, and I'm going to talk with Rob and Paula for about 40 minutes or so. And then we really want to welcome questions from you all. So please think as we're talking about the really juicy questions you can ask Rob and Paul in this really unique opportunity about this wonderful topic. So Rob and Paula, thank you for being here. As we talk, the audience is able to see some wonderful images going by. The images are not in any specific order in regards to what we'll be talking about, so I thought it would be great to have Paula and Rob talk a little bit about what you're seeing so you understand the context of what you're seeing.
Right, so the beginning part of the slides are all items taken from the show. So it's work that's in the show, and it ranges from the earlier, more expressionistic stuff, which is what's up right now, to the later, mature, asymmetric typography that the Bauhaus became primarily known for. So it's just all things you can see in the originals in the show, and good stuff.
Thank you. Very erudite.
I mean,
it is really good stuff.
It's good stuff. I'm looking at it here. It's good stuff.
Paula.
When I was in art school, Rob wasn't around, so I didn't get to learn about typography and the order in which it happened. I came about it sort of accidentally. So the things you're going to see are things that were actually influenced by specific periods of type, some of which Rob is talking about, some of which he isn't. But you're going to see things that may look like were done in a specific period, and they were done in specific periods in my life. Anyway, thank you, Rob.
Before we get into the sort of heart and soul of our conversation, as we were walking through the exhibit this morning, you pointed out various pieces that were created during the Bauhaus, that had inspired you. In what way did that help you educate yourself and learn about typography as you were growing and developing as a designer?
I was an academic. I looked at what I liked. I actually didn't interpret why I liked it, but by emulating it. And by the way, it's very hard to copy anything because you always fail. Mm-hmm. And when you fail, you actually invent something that's a different kind of amalgamation of it. And that's what I was doing.
Rob, the impetus for this exhibit was based on your 2021 book, Bauhaus Typography at 100, which you'll be also sharing today. The Bauhaus School began in 1919 with a manifesto written by Walter Gropius. For those in the audience that might not be fully familiar with the significance of the Bauhaus, can you share a little bit about the school? Just give everybody a little bit of a foundation and some of the core principles of the movement, any aspects of the manifesto that you think would be interesting to the audience.
Absolutely. So the manifesto was published in 1919. It's kind of the first object in the show, in a way. It had a beautiful woodcut cover by Lionel Feininger, and the text of the manifesto inside was by Gropius chiefly, although obviously working with the collaborators that were helping to found the school. And in that manifesto are many of the kind of core principles that I think are still important today from the Bauhaus. A lot of it's pedagogical. It had to do with breaking down silos between disciplines. Part of the concept was learning a core that cut across disciplines, so everybody had to learn how to set type, everybody had to learn how to do lettering, everybody had to learn how to do, and which is why you'll see in the show, this is actually the thing that's up right now, is a Herbert Bayer postcard from the show, and it's an example of, there are lots of things in the show that are by people that aren't graphic designers, so Paul Klee or Kandinsky or whatever, and but it was interdisciplinary in a way that was pretty new, and so that's, yeah, the manifesto was key. And later there was a circular diagram, which is also in the show, that kind of diagrams, an infographic of the pedagogy.
I always found that stuff very political. Like it was not something that I, in a funny way, related to, because I was looking at these forms as sort of ways of communicating to audiences about specific things.
Yeah.
And so many of these things were for abstract purposes, and they were exercises, and I never really understood the political relationships that were written about in the text. Could you elaborate on some of them?
Well, I wouldn't say that the Bauhaus was overtly political, although the Nazis hated it and eventually shut it down.
That's pretty political.
Well, I mean, ultimately, and Bayer and Moholy-Nagy came to the U.S. And were very influential here. But I think they tried not to be overtly. They were more of a party school, frankly. I mean, there's like 8 or 10 invitations to parties in the show, and they look really cool. Like, you know, the Metallica Fest, they're like dressing up in tinfoil, and they great excuses to party and drink. And so I think it was more of a party school than a political statement.
A lot of hooking
Although
up, too.
the freedom, I'm sure, the freedom of their approach and the interdisciplinary nature of it was they all featured in, there was a Nazi show called Entarrte Kunst, which means degenerate art, and there's a little catalog of that show, and it had like all the Bauhaus artists featured in it. The great irony.
It wasn't in the Bauhaus. It wasn't created by the Bauhaus.
It was done by the Nazis, and the irony was it was incredibly popular. Lines around the block to see it, but all the Bauhaus artists were in it.
There are some pieces of ephemera that I saw in the exhibit. One piece had a swastika, and another piece had, I don't know if it was a parody of Hitler. He had, I think, a knife in his mouth.
Yeah, it's Hitler with a knife in his mouth. Those two pieces come from Information magazine, which was published in the 1930s in Switzerland and designed by Max Bill. And it was very anti-Nazi. So I think the individual players had specific involvement. That one case is very political.
Paula, you looked like you wanted to say something.
Well, I just was sort of impressed by your own collection of works that were illustrative, which I had always thought was actually not part of the Bauhaus. I never really, I mean, you're partying in the flat colors and the sort of, I mean, that to me is the Bauhaus. This is the Bauhaus behind us, sort of these color relationships and scale and form. And then you managed to collect all these very elaborate pieces that I can't figure out how you got them and where they're from and who made them and why they're in the show and all of that.
Well, it's really, I'm glad that you brought that up. I think, for me, it was the most fun part of the show to do. And it's actually the work that was done at the Bauhaus before there was a typographic master and before there was type, that you could say, a way to set type and a way to print type. And those things came when they moved to Dessau in 1925, and Maholi became the first typographic master in 23. So this early work is, there was graphic design. There were invitations to things and postcards and posters and things that they needed around the school, and they printed them with a printmaking technique. So they could do woodcut and linocut and intaglio and silkscreen. And therefore, that early work is all, the lettering is all hand lettering, there's no type. The aesthetic of it is actually very sort of dense and expressionistic instead of clean and asymmetrical. And so it's a kind of an interesting counterpoint to the later, more better known work. That would be an example right now.
Yeah, this is much more unusual. It almost looks like Italian futurism a bit.
Mm-hmm.
You know, combined with some Art Deco kind of spirit.
I want to talk a little bit about some of the foundational principles. One thing that I read in Bauhaus Typography at 100 was that Johannes Itten was the school's spiritual guide, and he defined its early trajectory, which has been called a utopian phase. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what that meant in terms of utopian phase, and why did they need a spiritual guide at the Bauhaus?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure everyone would have agreed that they needed one, but Itten certainly felt like he was it. He's best known for color, but he actually had a much broader practice. And the reason he was so key in the early days is that he did the preliminary course, which was the sort of foundational little bit of everything course. And after he left, Maholi took it over, and that's when, and that was a major shift. Itten was mystical and a little weird. He had, very, he had an active following, but not everybody loved him. So he was a complicated character, and the work in the show of his is interesting. It's complex and dense, and I think very influential. That stuff echoed later. That, what we think of as classic Bauhaus typography, asymmetrical, type, clean, photography and photomontage, that kind of thing, which kind of flowed into mid-century modern graphic design in a very direct way. The early expressionistic stuff skipped a generation and came back in punk and early digital, and it's very much the same aesthetic.
And so how would you define what that utopian phase was supposed to be or mean?
Well, if you start a school and publish a manifesto, that is a utopian act in a way. And Gropius and the whole enterprise was somewhat utopian in that sense. I think when they were forced to move, they had to get real in a number of ways, one of which was financial. And it's when they got a lot more active commercially, selling works of the workshops. And then the typographic workshop, which was then led by Maholi, took commercial work in the local community. So it did shift and maybe became a little less utopian. But the core kind of breaking down of barriers is still intact. Yeah.
Paula, the German Bauhaus School existed for only 14 years. It came to the United States after, but in Germany it was only 14 years, 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that the Bauhaus remains so influential?
Well, some of it has to do with the fact that it's very easy to work with. I mean, it is somewhat formulaic, because if you understand the scale and form and principles of it, you can, in fact, make something, if the space is right, that's reasonably good. And it ultimately became kind of American modernism when the Europeans came to the States and used a lot of Helvetica and created what corporate design looks like today. For me, actually on the screen are very early pieces that you're seeing that were influenced by various periods of design. They were all mixed up, they were eclectic. I used them first on record covers, and usually to demonstrate music or to create some point of view about something. That I couldn't use that kind of modernism because unless the band was sophisticated in a certain kind of way, it actually would not represent the music. And it began, and I was doing these in the 70s. In the 80s, that became more popular as a form. Yeah. But generally, if you were trying to make some impression, you didn't use that because it was generic to a degree. That's what happened to it. And I don't quite understand how it did happen, but it was so useful to corporations because there was no message.
Yeah.
So that's, you know, if you consider it, and they all look the same, and they sort of have a little bit, some people did it badly, some people did it well, but that was the language that I grew up in. And that was what was surrounding me. And the contrast to that, as a student in high school, was Pushpin Studios. And Pushpin Studios did work that was based on all kinds of crazy historic forms. And I met and married Seymour Quast, and he taught me about all periods of typography. And really, after a period of time, I went my own way, and I very much mixed in American wood type, which was not at all European. But you're looking at the first book that we published for my studio in 1982 with my partner, Terry Coppell, and it was called Great Beginnings, and they were all famous novels designed in the style and period that would have existed when the novel was written. And that was all really things I had learned from Seymour. After a while, I started abandoning it. I think I worked historically, specifically, for maybe through the 80s, and then before I joined Pentagram, I had sort of dropped it because I started to become criticized for it, which was really upsetting and demoralizing because these things were adopted for a purpose. I mean, I used Mondrian for Manhattan Records because Broadway Boogie Woogie is in fact a map of Broadway. You know, like that they all had some reason for doing that, but they were conceptual more than stylistically pure or of any manifesto whatsoever. And I was selling music. That was my job.
Yeah, it's interesting that people object to things they don't necessarily understand.
Well, you take those risks. I mean, that's part of being a designer, you know, that you make things and you put them out in the marketplace and you find out whether or not people appreciate them. And sometimes you change and sometimes you say, screw you. You know, like it really depends upon what kind of attitude you want to have about it. It's your work and that sort of thing.
When I was doing the research for this panel discussion, I came across an anecdote that you shared in an interview about your first introduction to the Bauhaus methodology when you were a freshman at Tyler College of Art during a basic design class with a professor named Bob Stein. I was wondering if you can share that anecdote, because I think it's also interesting to have that sort of the way in which ideas influence your practice later in your career.
Well, he was my teacher in my freshman course called Basic Design. And remember, this is before the computers. And what you had to do to learn how to work with space was you cut out of a piece of black paper a square that was black, and you moved it around in a white space and then pasted it down where it was supposed to create tension in relationship to the positioning. I confess I didn't understand what the hell he was talking about, and I was sloppy, and I also had rubber cement blobs all over my pieces, and I brought them to him, and he just thought they were terrible, and at one point asked me why I was here. Then, when he gave me my final review, he said, "Tell me, why are you here? What do you want?" And I said, I want to be an artist. And he said, "Cooking is an art." And that was sort of it. 2 years went by, and I got into another design course that was more about ideas, and that's where I found myself. Years later, not so many years actually, because I was in the music industry, and the covers were very prevalent, and people saw them, and he called me up and he asked me to talk to his class. And I just thought it was so funny. So I took the train down to Philadelphia from New York, and he introduced me, and he said, this is one of my former students, and I can take no credit whatsoever for her success. And I thought that was just very generous.
Well, at least he was honest. Rob, you have been collecting the work that we see in this exhibit for about 40 years. Talk about why...
Actually, I think 50.
50, okay.
Yeah, almost.
Somewhere's between 40 and 50.
Yeah.
Talk about what first inspired you to do this.
Well, I was a designer.
Well, so were a lot of people there. We're not collecting for 40 years on the Bauhaus.
If I say that with a design crowd, usually it's like people just sort of nod, because if you're a designer, you gather inspiration around you. You collect stuff.
Sure.
There's stuff all over. And I don't know a designer that doesn't collect something. And for me, it just started with like reference books and the stuff that I had in school, and then it got a little more involved. But in the 80s, it wasn't expensive, and so there's one piece in the show that I remember acquiring in 1981 for $5. And
what would it go for now?
Maybe 2,500 or so. Yeah, probably about that. Although we don't think about monetary value anymore. As soon as you establish a nonprofit and the collection becomes the core of it, it's in public trust. There's no sense of ownership, and there's no reason to consider value other than risk management.
So what was the criteria for collecting the work back then? And what was your curatorial vision in creating the narrative arc of this exhibition?
Okay. So two questions. When I started, it was just stuff that I thought was cool, that would inspire my work in some way, either in design or in teaching. And one of the things that I began to do as I got more serious as a collector is just to push the edges of that, the definition of that scope, so that it was no longer just about graphic design. It included graffiti and concrete poetry and text-based art, other things that are come at design problems sideways. And the Bauhaus show really is. It was something that, it was the first show because we had just moved, and for the first time we had a gallery. And so it was kind of important. It was a kind of a coming out for the world of the archive as an exhibiting institution, and also the exhibition catalog. And so we picked something that there was enough depth in the collection to do it well, because everything in the show is in the collection of the archive, and that's one of the things about our exhibition and publishing programs, is that they're basically intended to showcase the collection. So that was the start of it. The things that ended up unique about the Bauhaus show curatorially, I think chiefly it's the balance of including the early expressionistic work, which isn't seen as often, and isn't frankly collected as often either.
Why is that?
Why is that? Well, it doesn't fit the narrative. It doesn't, it's not what we think of as Bauhaus typography.
I mean, it really is shocking, actually, when you see it.
Yeah.
If you know the Bauhaus well, or your expectation of it, when you see that work in that context, you're totally, flummoxed by it. Like, where did that come from?
Right.
Who was that guy?
Yeah.
Was he the school?
And it's some of the same
jerk?
people. It's some of the same people. I mean, Bayer himself did things that were very expressionistic. So yeah, it's a bit. It's fun to say shocking. I think it is shocking. Like if you're a graphic designer and you think you know Bauhaus typography, you walk into the first room of the exhibit, and I'd like you to be shocked. It's not what you'd expect.
It's like Massimo Vignelli suddenly doing that. That's
Right.
how you. That's
yeah,
how you feel.
yeah, Massimo doing an Ed Fella.
Yeah.
So in terms of the way that you put the exhibit together, what was the decision-making process and how you organized it and how you exhibited the various phases and time using time and influence throughout the exhibit?
It was just about finding logical groupings of work. It's generally in chronological order. It covers, so the time span of the school itself is 1919 to 1933. The show has work from a few decades earlier right up to a few years ago. And so with both the Bauhaus masters and some of the other work that was by their peers or by people responding to the work later, there's a span of time that kind of allows the through lines to show up. And the most obvious one is what we think of as Bauhaus typography in that day by their peers and then flowing into mid-century modern. And that's what most of the show is. But the more expressionistic stuff has, it shocks you at the beginning, and then there are echoes of it at the end with Emigre and Ed Fella. So.
How has the Bauhaus shaped typography over time? And this is something I'd love for you both to answer.
Oh, it's incredibly influential. The simple forms of we were talking before when we were going through the exhibit just about the font Futura and the weights and the styles and the drawings of it. And there are so many versions of it. And actually, you're looking at something on the screen that's actually really Futura based if you look at the pure form of it.
Right.
It's everywhere. And the design of Helvetica, which is the other major workhorse typeface, was later and very legible, but never had the grace of Futura. It's just amazing font. I think that the positioning of circles, squares, and bars were never done better than in the Bauhaus.
Yeah.
And what was the impetus for circles, squares, and triangles and bars? Like, what was the foundation of that being the visual language of the Bauhaus?
Okay, now we need Ellen Lupton to really answer that for us. There were core principles of form and also principles of color, and oddly they related. So, the triangle, the circle, and the square had sort of correct colors. And it was part of the foundational course, but it was also just one of the ideas of the Bauhaus. One of the things that they did in the pedagogy is try to go down to the essence and to simplify and get at the core of things.
Do you know why a specific color was associated to the triangle and the square?
I should know this. I don't.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's funny.
I can't believe I've stumped you.
No, I'm not a Bauhaus scholar broadly. Although I did a lot of reading working on the show. I don't know everything about it. It's
what?
Very. I'm.
So
I'm
you
a type
collect
nerd.
because you love the work.
Yeah, fundamentally.
Paula, tell us about how the Bauhaus typography has influenced you over the arc of your career, because I think that there are different phases where you pulled influence.
The thing about it is it's so easy to work with. It works perfectly in black and white. It doesn't need color. And a lot of things in the show are in black and white, or they're black, white, and red, which I picked up and used for years. That was easy. You never make a mistake. Anybody trying it, use that. You'll succeed. And it's really a wonderful vehicle. Also, the relationship of the forms, which are geometric forms, are perfect. They're unquestionable, and so that when you're moving them in certain territories, you're not making mistakes. In the right hands, it's gorgeous, and then if somebody doesn't understand principles of scale, then it becomes difficult. But it's one thing. There are many things, and it's a good tool.
Talk about homage. I know that certain things that you've created, you talked a little bit earlier about people being outraged by something that you made. There were certain things that you created that were parody. People didn't necessarily understand that.
Right.
Certain aspects of some things that you made were homage. People didn't understand that. Talk a little bit about influence and the way in which you've created some of your work using some of the threads of the past.
Well, I have to go into my past, which is walking into a design world where everything was either sort of designed by Swiss modernism, or it was Herb Luballin's very curvaceous forms of typography. And there seemed to be no other alternate views. And so that's when I really was interested in history, to find out this couldn't always have been, even though it seemed to just permeate the 70s. Mm-hmm. So it was sort of great to go back and rediscover forms, typefaces. I worked with a terrific typesetter in those days who had an incredible collection of American wood types that I began working with very early, just simply because the forms were so powerful and looked so strong and made the work look contemporary because it didn't look like the other work. Some things people said, oh, you're regurgitating the past, which was true. And other things, they looked new because they didn't know the past. Mm-hmm. And that in design, this is always going on. There are periods because we gravitate to the new. There are people who are early adopters and are there first. There are people that take a long time and like it just as they go out of style. And these things belong to everybody who makes things. All painters do this with other painters' work, largely because that's how we grow. And we stand on somebody else's shoulders.
One of the things that I think, for me, that's so fascinating about the Bauhaus was the community, that there was this camaraderie, this place where people went, they all worked together, they were influenced by each other, they collaborated in really, really interesting and unique ways. Have we ever seen that specific kind of approach to work since in other communities?
That's what Pentagram was supposed to be, my dear.
Ah.
No, seriously, what fascinated me about the Bauhaus is I don't think they were that like-minded. A lot of them were constructivists from Russia when they entered. Mm-hmm. They didn't have the same political thinking of the other guys. I mean, they were, very obsessed with the future of what was the Soviet Union at that point.
So what then motivated the creation of this community? If they weren't like-minded necessarily, I mean, yes, there was this love of form and art and graphic design and communication.
It was Gropius's vision to create it, and he gathered together the original masters and developed the pedagogy and the concepts, and it sort of evolved from there and went through in 14 years they were in 3 locations. They had 3 directors. It was not just a straight line. So, yeah.
There were even 2 women.
Yeah, can you imagine?
Yeah.
2.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, so this is interesting. Everybody thinks the Bauhaus was the place where breaking down these kinds of barriers in art education started. Actually, it started in the Vienna Secession. And I just learned a bunch about that because we published a book about it. But I had not been aware of how visionary they were in many of the same ways, breaking down disciplines. They were actually more welcoming to women and published their work more. So it wasn't like a lightning bolt of brilliance that came only to Gropius and the Bauhaus. And there have been schools, there was the Ulm School, which was specifically kind of an echo of the Bauhaus in Germany, which also didn't last long and was shut down by the government, weirdly. And there have been schools in the U.S., like Black Mountain, that are super influential and kind of carry some of that ethos. But sometimes it's just the magic of a place and time.
You mentioned Walter Gropius, and I read also in your book that Walter Gropius aimed to unify all forms of visual art beneath the roof of architecture. And why architecture? Why a building?
Well, I think he thought of, when he diagrammed the pedagogy, it looked architectural, because he was an architect. So it was his lens. I don't think it really ended up being that. And I'm not sure in hindsight he would have described it the same way.
There's that really big Bauhaus book that has all the people that were in it. And what you get if you actually go through it and read it is that graphic design was not necessarily the first goal of the organization. A lot of it was about architecture, a lot of it was about theory, a lot of them were painters. who were doing this thing together, and that's how that developed. So it isn't like it was this graphic design group that sort of rose that way. They came from a lot of other disciplines. And, how many members were there? There were like 28 or 30 or something? Or
Oh, the masters?
Yeah.
Oh, well, more than that over time, and hundreds of students. So it was a large community.
Who determined that they were masters?
Well, they got hired. I mean,
Was it
that was the term
self-determined?
that. No.
Okay.
No. They were hired to be the instructors. So, and they shifted over time. That was just the term they used for instructor or leader of the class.
Polly, people seem to be able to recognize type and form more than they used to, and you've said that this is in large part due to our use of computers, which give us more access to fonts. Do you think that this expanded knowledge has impacted any of the ways we design with type?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is that people recognize form, so it means that they recognize logos faster. That if you create a campaign and you telegraph some image of, say, typography in color, they'll begin to identify it immediately with a particular message or organization. And that's very powerful. And that's also, through use of Instagram, consider what people see and how they understand it immediately in this very small space. So it has changed the way we design and think about design, the way we think about typography, what is capable. Right now, it's, I think, the best period for typography because the software has made it possible for more designers to draw their own fonts, program their own fonts, make their fonts accessible to organizations to have it for sole ownership so they can become recognizable. That is a huge shift. And a really big deal. It's really
I mean, now that there are licenses for type and they need to be renewed, and there's an entire business just on the licensing of typography, which is really now as much of a part of design as any other aspect, if not the most important part.
I mean, think about the idea of what a logo was. A logo was a form, and so much of it derived by the kind of visual language of the Bauhaus, where you recognize the form, thereby recognize the product when used in repetition over and over. A circle was always sort of preferable, or a square. You got something a little goofy, you had a little trouble with it maybe. But the fact of the matter was that these things existed usually in the bottom or left-hand corner of an ad, and you recognize them. Now you can change form and people recognize the form changing if you adhere to certain characteristics about what you're designing. So you can take something and you can shape it in a different form, but it'll have the same colors and some of the same visual criteria, and you'll begin to recognize it as the same thing. That is a big deal because it enables communications to be quicker and to be more clear in a way, because sometimes you're dealing with spaces or positions where you wouldn't necessarily recognize something before that was expected. So this is huge, and I think for graphic designers, it's a great time to be working.
Yeah, I'm
sorry. I was just going to say the popular interest is the archive wouldn't exist without it. It's the reason that we were able to get started, and it's the reason that we've developed the following we have. It's just kind of feels like the perfect time. But 10 years ago, never would have made it.
Well, interesting. 10 years is about it's about your anniversary time. And
True.
You've said that innovation in design is always in conversation with the past. Mm-hmm. I want to know if you still agree with that, and I also want to know what Paula thinks about that.
Yeah, I absolutely do still agree with it. So first of all, the curatorial vision of the archive is very different from, any questions you might ask me about my developing the collection as a collector and designer, because it's a different thing now. And the question we ask ourselves as a curatorial team is, might this inspire designers in 100 years?
And how do you know?
Which is a judgment. It's a judgment. It's entirely subjective.
Yeah.
And we do it as a team and with different, a range of inputs. and also a strong effort to, I mean, our collection now is becoming worldwide, so it's including other scripts and languages. And so, anyway.
Paula, what do you think? Is innovation in design always in conversation with the past?
Without history, you're lost in space. There's nothing that grounds it. You know, like you invent things that are new, but they're never totally new because that's impossible.
One thing that I was struck by in thinking about the Bauhaus and how we all work now, you know, the Bauhaus was trying to create an environment where essentially anybody could do anything. You could be, they were all expected in many ways to be polymaths.
Right.
And designers today, without even, I think, realizing it, especially if you're under 30, are really required to have so much more expertise than older designers needed to have in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, in that we're now expected to do all our own typesetting. We're now expected to do all our own retouching. And it's hard to imagine thinking back. You know, I grew up learning design on a drafting table.
Yeah.
So I learned how to spec type and cut rubylith. And the idea, if I had to think about what is required now to be a designer, it's really quite extraordinary. There's almost an expectation that you're a polymath.
I disagree with you in a certain capacity because I think that the same skills are required. It's just not the same technology and operating equipment. I mean, I grew up designing on a Lucy, for Christ's sake. You know, when we got a photostat machine, that was a big deal.
Oh yeah.
You know, I mean, these things, but that doesn't have anything to do with anything. That's just.
Do people know what a Lucy is? It's a. No, you do it. You do it.
I'm embarrassed.
No, don't be. This is really.
You would make a sketch of something, and you'd take a piece of tracing paper, and it was like a camera, and you could blow it up, and when you got it up to the size you wanted, then you could take another piece of tracing paper on the top end, and you could trace your form, and that's how you enlarged things to see what things looked like when they were big.
Yeah.
And then you made a mechanical of it, and the printer took a picture of the mechanical and swiped things in here. But you can't tell the difference of the technology if I show you printed pieces from 50 years ago or now. And some of them are fairly amazing because what got lost is this kind of handcraft. There used to be mechanical guys who would argue that if you used an X-Acto knife, which was invented after the razor blade, that you were doing something really wrong.
Yeah.
This is true.
But so the part where I think we agree is all of that drafting work has sort of gone by the wayside, and designers now are essentially giving printers printing-ready proof
They give them files, but I'll go one farther. I just completed a project that is sizable. It's a website that is we created on Midjourney, and it's got illustrations that we've programmed in. There are 2,500 icons that are used on this little site for the government, and it self-runs. It self-selects the illustrations that go in because they were icons put into a format, and it's the most control of any kind of communication I ever designed because it's not designed for anybody to manage it. By the way, that cover, the Leonard Bernstein cover, was an actual piece of stained glass that we built. It was done by a guy named Nick Fasciano, and the typography is me, and it was painted, and that was the way a record cover was done. And it took less time than things take now because nobody approved it but Leonard Bernstein.
Well, I think this is an opportune time to open up to audience questions. Any questions for Rob? Any questions for Paula? We have one question over here, gentleman in the blue.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'm curious on whether in kind of looking at the Bauhaus forms and design while doing typography and design in the modern era, if the sort of forms that have been long applied to the Roman alphabet have been applied to different languages with different alphabets, like Chinese or Arabic or Hebrew?
Not really. Not very often, unless they're trying to imitate Western alphabets.
Yeah.
We're using a lot of Eastern influence in our type design these days, particularly from India, Pakistan, and that sort of script. And the Pentagram office in London does a lot of work with the Middle East and has been sort of making combined fonts that can read both ways. And that's, I think the world is getting much closer in its understanding of form.
Thank you for that question. We have three more. Okay, so the gentleman in the hat, and then a woman in the back, and then a person over here on the side, and then there's one more over here.
Hi, thank you very much. Really very interesting. One thing about the Bauhaus, which I've always loved, it's striking, always striking, and it's very unique and always, it speaks of the era and the time, and you guys hanker back to it with what you're doing now. Do you believe that, when I think of contemporary, I think of like Shepard Fairey and Obey Giant when it comes to propaganda and the work that's similar to what the Bauhaus does. Do you believe there's going to be a new school that's going to be as influential as the Bauhaus now as it was then?
That's a good question. It's sort of really broken up around the globe. What I see is becoming influential is design from other cultures influencing each other into sort of one giant glop, and particularly in the field of typography, because we have much more control over it now. I mean, the Bauhaus, formalistically, was a perfect way to think about typography because you were dealing with these very specific, simple forms that still look terrific, and that if you look at different forms of calligraphy, they seem too complex and not clear, but people are learning to establish recognizability with those, and that's important.
Well, also, fonts now are available in superfamilies that include multiple scripts, and large brand. You work with this kind of stuff all the time. The things you're talking about with the Middle East and so on, a lot of times it's essentially one font design that has a Roman, an Arabic, a Hebrew. And so that's opened up new possibilities. It also kind of forces everything into the same constraints. And you were asking earlier about the Bauhaus, the influence of Bauhaus around the world, and I think there is an influence in the corporate branding world around the world because it's part of what comes through with this flow, and the type is the same. So,
thank you. There was another question back here. Yeah, I'm just going to go in the order that we saw them.
Hi. I had a question about your Midjourney experience, and I'm curious which parts of it were, or which parts of the experience benefited from your creative spirit and your humanness that the process couldn't have done, or could it?
All of it.
All of it.
Midjourney's a machine. It's got stuff in there. Recently, I was at a conference where my friend Marion Banshees did this terrific report on what's not in there, like bottoms of horses or stuff like that. I mean, there's just things that never got programmed into it. When you talk to Midjourney, it's the same as designing. Instead of pushing buttons to make the thing happen or draw to make the thing happen, you talk to it, and it's very nice to you. But it doesn't necessarily get everything you want in the first prompt. So we created an icon system by making a little painting of stylistic icons. And we wanted the icons to look painterly, not like typical drawn icons, even though they had to read like them. So there had to be a little bit of an edge of smeared paint and some other characteristics to it that we did in this series of drawings. And we did 5 prompts to get it the way we wanted. And it was not easy because you had to analyze why Midjourney wasn't doing it, and then you realized your prompt was too long, or you didn't have an emphasis on the right word. It was more like talking to this robot-like person, and it ultimately could create it. And that once it could create it and it had the form, you could change the form by it going to classic other icons that exist within the system. So if they had to, it was about government performance in certain areas. So if you're talking about low-income housing and what is the government doing about it, you begin to see that it can make millions of houses. So it's easy to establish the breadth of icons by giving it the style by which they would create the house. We also did graphs and charts that way. And it was a lot of fun. And we have a plotter at Pentagram, and we printed all of them out on one form, and it was just a joyous thing to see. I don't know if I'm going to love doing this forever, but the experience was really invigorating because it's possible. And I do think in the future we'll be talking to our equipment, and people won't know that they typed.
Mm-hmm. I'm conscious of our being at time. We have a couple more questions. We can do one more question? Okay. So I have to go back to the order that we were in. And yes. We can have a whole other panel discussion on Midjourney and design. Mm-hmm. And Paul, I just want to say, you are one of the few true masters that is completely welcoming of new technology.
Well, I never typed.
Well.
Mm. Yeah.
In the last few years, I've noticed that the Adobe programs are restricting some old fonts that we used to own. I'm curious what your thoughts are with the Adobe Type Cloud and how that's going to affect design.
Don't get me started.
Well, we have 2 people from Adobe on our board, so I'll recuse myself.
No, it isn't just Adobe. I think that we were talking
Adobe.
about earlier how the type foundries and creators of typography were partners with graphic designers. And because the equipment and what the computer has done enable for people to draw and program their own fonts has made them nervous. And so they've become very protective. They have really strict licensing agreements. And I think that they're making, in many ways, a huge mistake because they're going to make themselves irrelevant if it continues. And that's sad because you're looking at type right now that was American wood type that came from the letterpress house, and like I mess around with it and all of that. But this originally used to be something that we used to get in alphabets, photostat, and cut up, and it was wonderful. And then we began to be able to make it on computers, and then they became less necessary. But that, to me, is the loss of a craft that maybe shouldn't go away, and I'm not quite sure how they get reintroduced back into a contemporary life.
How much fun has this been? Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you all.
Paula shared, just to give you a little bit more detail, there will be tours of Bauhaus typography at 100 at the Resnick Center for Herbert Baer Studies today at 12:30 and at 11:30 a.m. tomorrow. On Friday.
Somebody's got a van away.
And then Paula will be conducting a design workshop tomorrow titled "The Logo of Your Life." Don't miss either. Thank you, everybody.